Thanks very much for the introduction, and I've been listening in the audience, as have you, over this morning's sessions, and pretty much everyone has said something about sustainability, something about carbon. We're going to anchor that in a session with a deep dive on exactly that. Now, I also spend plenty of time out from one end of Australia almost to the other, talking to farmers, and the interesting thing about 2024 is they'd be happy not to talk about carbon. To be honest, we've heard a bit about it. It's always mentioned here, there and everywhere, but there's compelling reasons why we need to. And the way I've come to see this, particularly in 2024, is something of a tightrope between what expectations we have on one side and the growing realities in the farming world of the other. And nothing like some market volatility, some seasonal volatility, to bring the focus back down to productivity. And these other things, well, are they optional? Are they nice to have? Or are they really need to have when the chips are down? I understand that. But macro trends still guide our future, and carbon's part of that. So why is carbon still ramping up? I'm going to touch on that. We need to talk about methane. I will talk to that. Can we change the case for reducing emissions and what we might be able to do? And lastly, what does it mean? How do we keep it real and how do we take it home? So there are a range of trends and they've been touched on variously this morning, but let me bring it back together, driving this issue. One is government. We have an emission reduction expectation from the federal government, 43% on a 2005 baseline by 2030, net zero by 2050. For good measure, a hastily adopted methane pledge of 30% reduction on methane between 2020 and 2030. Unfortunately, sheep numbers went up in that time period. We're halfway through and not even halfway through, and sheep numbers and emissions up are at least 16% to start with, so there's some challenges there. We have investors and finance. Who are the people who are going to be out speaking about this at farm level? Banks are. Partly because there are powerful forces at work in that sector to drive what's called net zero financed emissions. So that's not just the emissions from running a bank, of course, it's the emissions for the businesses that they support financially and lend to. We have customers. And for those at the market-ending face of this, there's not a day go by without requests for information about the products that are being sold. So I'll take a good example from Thomas Foods being asked, what is the carbon footprint of this rack of lamb, of this shipment of lamb that you just provided for us? Now, frank, honest answer to that today is, it's about X. We don't know specifically what it is because that's drawn from hundreds of farms across Australia doing all the different business practices that go into farming in a unique way. It's an incredibly complex question to answer. And so just as Angus pointed out, data is what's going to drive this story. It's an absolute crucial part of the integrity message, and yet, even at that point, we face a tightrope. Because I can tell you, we can go out and spend $20,000, $30,000, $100,000 trying to quantify carbon on one single farm. And that's not viable, that's not sustainable. So our systems don't yet support all the integrity that the market says they want. 9 times out of 10, customers don't really know the implications of what they want. They want a number, they want a reduction, and yet they perhaps only just dawning on them that affects the way businesses operate across the other side of the planet at a seismic level. And Brett made the point earlier this morning that who really is driving this discussion? Now, something worth taking note of, SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, is a global driving force behind setting emission reduction expectations at business level, customer level. A brand that signs up to that sort of agreement sets an expectation, a requirement to reduce emissions, not just in their business, but in every product that they buy. And that expectation moves steadily down the supply chain. And finally, sometimes years after the target is set, we start to hear about it. Interestingly enough, beef's been a little bit more at the leading edge, or the bleeding edge of this topic, but just in 2022, having not really heard the market in a really specific way talk about it too much in wool, China started asking the question, what's your carbon footprint in Australia? 2024. The message finally sinking in and flowing through and down the supply chain. And then there's, for many of us in the room, I grew up running sheep, cattle, cropping, northern New South Wales. We still have a farming interest there. I do it because I love it. Most of us do. There's not a farmer in the room who has a fundamental view that I'm out to rape and pillage and destroy the place to make a quick buck. It's just not in the ethos. Farmers have an ethos of sustainability by nature. But it's fair to say that what that means to the consumer, what that means in society, has shifted. It's not enough just to say, I keep the grass green when it rains. There's expectations, and one of them is carbon. Quite difficult to grasp because we can't see it for the most part. We're talking about gases. Trees are about the only thing you can physically see. But otherwise, in carbon, we can't see it very easily. We've got to model the outcomes. It's all complex. And yet, it's an integral part of the sustainability message of agriculture. I was speaking to another market-facing brand manager yesterday, and they were saying, we want to talk nature positive to brands, but we've got to get through the gate of carbon first. We've got to be able to explain our message and our positioning on carbon to get to that next stage, because it's seen as a prerequisite now in many companies who've set science-based targets. So where did it all begin and why? What's actually driving this story? In 2015, global governments agreed through something called the Paris Agreement, firstly, that climate change was a real and driving force in the planet, that exceeding 2 degrees of warming would have untold and potentially catastrophic impacts, and that to turn it around, we needed net zero carbon dioxide emissions, and that probably the fastest we could hope to get there was 2050. Now, there's a couple of things you need to take really careful note of. The first time warming will cease when it relates to carbon dioxide is when the level gets to zero. The net level gets to zero. That's 2050. Warming will continue to get worse every year up until that point. That's why the temperature graph keeps rising. That's very significant. For each of us, we produce a little bit of carbon dioxide. We drove a vehicle here today. If it's part of your business, it's part of your carbon account. And every time you run an engine, it produces a little bit of emissions that go in the atmosphere, and effectively they stay there, generating that warming effect. But as I'm going to touch on in a minute, that's far from the whole story and not even the dominant message in animal agriculture. So I'll come back to that. So that's governments. Before we were thinking about it, 2015, they were setting the guidance. Companies then largely followed, and these are major meat businesses globally, and their stated position around carbon. Many in that sort of 20 to 30 odd % reduction expectation by 2030, and net zero just conveniently a little bit before 2050 is usually how it's gone. And that's, without being too facetious, sometimes as much thinking as was put into it. The world says we need to get there by 2050. The marketing people say it'll be a better story if we say we'll get there by 2040. So let's say that. The actual planning behind it, the understanding of how to drive it, is somewhat a work in progress. And I'll touch on that when we get to the realities of it in a moment. Now, it is a challenge for us, right? These figures, impacts carbon dioxide equivalent carbon footprints for meat products at retail shelf level for Australian products. So grass-fed beef, lamb, pork, chicken. If I extended that out and put tofu there, it would be another step down below chicken. Okay, so we have a higher emission product under the governing ruling systems and reporting systems. And it's all because of methane, which we'll touch on in a moment. So that's the meat story. I want to put this figure up because it really struck me when Brett was speaking before that the demand for plant-based products has really tanked. And one remarkable thing about red meat, it's a fantastic quality product. We all love it, but actually so do our consumers. They really love it. And it's not very substitutable. The challenge in fibre is that it is somewhat substitutable. And when I say somewhat, that's the figure. And that's not 3 years of data, that's decades of data. And the challenge is, where there is a substitutable product, the risk profile of this is at another order of magnitude. And the debate in the market really has to take consideration about, if we stay silent, if we do nothing, well, will we just remain our incumbent position? Or do we need to act? All right, so that's some of the position, and that's some of the tightrope. We've got to listen to the market. We've heard a lot about that this morning. We also need to get a grasp of our own situation and really understand it, and some of it's quite complex. First is the issue of methane. Why on earth is the emission profile of lamb and beef at the top of that scale? And it really boils down to this. Ruminant animals, in consuming forage that we can't eat and monogastric species can't eat, generate a small amount of a byproduct, methane, when they break down fibre in their rumen. It's about 6%, give or take, of the gross energy consumed. And actually, methane was being researched in ruminant agriculture long before climate change was on the agenda, in the 60s. And it was being researched because it was part of the key to unlocking productivity. Methane's the same stuff as natural gas. It'll burn if you light it, and consequently, every unit lost is energy lost from the animal, not going into wool, not going into meat. If we could reduce that, the theory went, we could get a productivity dividend. And part of the challenge in that research space for the last, several decades since then, we've probably invested $500 million globally in research to reduce methane. We've got some great options. The productivity story has just not quite been there. And that's made it a particularly challenging space for adoption. Okay, so in our standard way of accounting for emissions, we have a few different gases. One's CO2 from fossil fuel, pretty straightforward. We burn it, it releases gas in the atmosphere. We also potentially have emissions from soils, trees. I'd say emissions for a start. If you cut down a tree and burn it, it will generate emissions, let them go in the atmosphere. If you grow a tree, you'll suck that emission back out of the atmosphere, and we call that a removal on the carbon account. Same deal with soil. We also have this methane, and the issue with this is that a small amount of it, lost from the animal when they graze, has a big warming effect. So the standard rules tell us 28 times the impact of CO2, and a small amount of nitrous oxide, not even carbon, but it contributes to global warming at a high rate. Now that central figure there, that's the global carbon account. And for the most part, the big green wedge is fossil fuel driven CO2. That's why when you hear policy spoken of at governmental level, it's co-linked to energy, really tight, because it's tied up in fossil fuel. There's a small wedge there of methane, about 15% of the global carbon account. The issue is, for beef and sheep, our profile looks like that. It's not driven by CO2, and for all the initiatives you can put in place, the best you'll do is reduce your profile 1, 2, 3% by focusing on CO2. We've got to address methane. here's some of the interesting and complicated facts. Methane, I said with CO2 before, it builds up in the atmosphere. Methane doesn't. It breaks down the atmosphere in about a 10-year cycle. And that means that stable sheep numbers have or lead to a stable amount of methane in the atmosphere. The way I think about it, for every stock unit you have, there's a little cloud of methane in the atmosphere. It's not getting bigger, it's not getting smaller either. It's having a warming effect today. But it's not increasing. And that's very significant when we come to setting reduction targets. Because a steady and small decline in methane will stabilise temperature. That goal that society needs to get to and won't achieve until 2050 in CO2 can be achieved faster with a small reduction pathway for methane. And lo and behold, Paris says the same thing. The target for 2050 is a carbon dioxide target. It's not a methane target. The requirement is strong reductions in methane. Okay, so that's what that figure gives us, is a CO2 target. Now we understand that. What do we need to do with methane? And, well, there's a physical climate science answer to that, which is anything down to only 10% reduction. And then there's a debated position of the argy-bargy in policy land between sectors. And you get somewhere in the order of 20 to 60% of the numbers that get quoted on how much you need to reduce methane from. So I'm going to make a couple of policy points, and the first one is that the Australian government doesn't recognise this today. We have what's called a bundled gas target, where all of them are lumped in together. And so implicitly, we have a net zero methane target today in Australia. That risks overshooting the requirement to reduce and making it very, very hard in the meantime for us in farming. Okay, so having said that, that's one side of the tightrope. I've been all on that angle, and now I'm going to get on the other angle. What actually can we do to reduce emissions? And I'm going to speak principally at industry-wide scale, and we've spent 3 years trawling the numbers and the technologies for AWI and MLA to try to set or understand what pathways can be achieved for emission reduction at national scale. It's tremendously hard to do and fraught with uncertainty because we're trying to predict something about the future. First line there is business as usual. With no real effort to reduce emissions, we'll bumble around, trundle along somewhere in the 15 to 20 million tonne range under the current accounting. It would take then some considerable and quite radical emission reduction pathways to bring us down to net zero. 2040, really from our point of view, is all but a pipe dream. 2050, well, with considerable effort, perhaps, and seismic change in the way we do farming. And then we cast a line, that dotted one in the middle that doesn't follow all the rules, about where we would stabilise our climate position, so our warming position. And it doesn't require us to get to zero. So in casting those numbers, if we look at the net zero emissions side, based on current technologies, what we know, adoption rates, costs, we think 34% reduction in methane would be a pretty good effort. Now, I hope I'm wrong. Predictions are like that. I think Brett was saying this morning, no one asks you when you're casting 3 years ahead. Well, we're casting 27 years ahead, so I'm probably in safe ground. No one will check back to see whether we really got 34%. I hope I'm wrong, by the way. I hope we get that silver bullet to cut through. But current technologies, current price, the fact that we're stuffing with biological systems that have the annoying habit of resetting an equilibrium, resistant to change, that's what we think. So where do you get there? I said energy is only a small part of the game. So outside of methane, you've really got to ramp up removals. You've got to ramp that up through trees and soil to have any hope of getting there. Now, this is not a preferred path. This is what we think you would have to do if you wanted to pursue that outcome to get to that net zero position. All right, so what does it actually take to do that on farm, and even more so, what might it cost? You can boil it down really into 4 levers. You can improve and optimise productivity. You can directly reduce emissions through technology. You can grow more trees, or let more trees be established, and you can build soil carbon. Effectively 4 things to do to shift the dial. The more ambitious your goal, the more you'll have to pull all of them. There doesn't appear at this point to be a silver bullet where we can throw everything just at one. Okay, so these are numbers that we've been aggregating and actually it's first sort of road test today, so I'd be pretty interested to hear the feedback. I'm going to slow up and try and explain what this figure is telling us. These are from analyses that we've done from farm scale to regional scale to national scale, the numbers that are in the AESSF. And they're reported here as a carbon footprint, kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of live weight, lamb, on that axis, and on the bottom, protein per dry sheep equivalent. Now, one of the whole challenges has been that, of course, sheep may produce wool and meat. Some dorpers in the middle don't produce the wool side, so how do you get an equivalence? Well, both of them produce a high protein product. So when we strip out and get down to just protein produced, so about 18% of live weight is protein, clean wool's protein. We get ourselves down on the protein measure, we find that more productive sheep systems produce between 6 and 8 kilograms of protein per DSC. That lines up with a carbon footprint there of around about 6.5 to 7 in that territory. Now, one thing to note is that that's a curve, not a line. There's a biological limit to how much we're going to be able to reduce the carbon footprint of stock. It's tied to feed intake, therefore it's tied to biology. There's only so much we can do to ramp up production. There's also handbrakes, if you like. So we can produce more lambs per ewe, we can produce lambs faster, heavier, but our inputs do tend to rise the harder we drive that system, and that has the effect of moderating how much improvement we can make. So we think, it's yet to be tested, but we think we're probably going to reach a biological low end somewhere in that 5.5 kilograms of emissions per kilogram of lamb live weight. Now, for those of you who are astute and looking at the numbers, the previous figure had more like 20 kilograms of emissions per kilogram of retail product. So that's the jump between live weight and retail product. Mass loss, the numbers jump up and up and up as we get to retail level. But this is at live weight farm gate, and that X is the national average. Just to put it back into numbers you're a bit more familiar with, roughly 4 kilograms of greasy and 23 kilograms live weight gets you that sort of 7 kilograms of protein. So we'll be able to make change, but it's not going to be infinite until we do new activities that bend the curve artificially. And let's talk about what they are for a moment. We have supplements that will reduce methane when they're fed, which is one of the big breakthroughs of the $500 million of research, is a couple of silver bullets that will reduce emissions. Much more work done in cattle than in sheep. Definitely in the cattle world, we're confident of 85 to 90% emission reduction in methane in a feedlot. The early research, and I want to say the global research in grazing livestock, you can almost count up the number of animals, they wouldn't make much of a flock. Very little research in grazing animals, but tends to be below that level of grain feeding. So you see there the numbers for Bovaer on one side and Asparagopsis in that sort of 30 to 50, 60% emission reduction territory. Maybe it'll do better in time. But if you put a line through it, most of those supplements fall somewhere between 20 and 50%. And that's where we think it's more likely reality at a farm scale on grass. The next big challenge when you think macro scale, industry scale, is how the heck do we feed that to 70 million sheep? And that's why we think the adoption challenge is very large, the barriers are quite high, and it'll take time. Now, there are some other options there. There's been some products floating around for years that we've known about, nitrate, oil, fat in diet, all quite reliable. Then some that look kind of exciting. Forage brassicas there, around about 20% emission reduction. Chicory has been a bit variable. Bicerula. A few things that obviously stock will self-dose on. And if they fit in your system and they fit there profitably already, then it might just be a zero cost abatement strategy. And that makes a tremendous difference, because that range there from $1 per DSC to $15 per DSC, one, maybe you could consider at the low end. At the top end, we're out. We can't do that. And that's where the high cost supplements tend to be at the moment, at that higher end. What's possible in soil carbon? Well, we see some paddocks on some farms offering an opportunity. Where there's high rainfall and where there's rundown country is our perspective on soil carbon. So sometimes, some places, somewhere. And the thing about soil carbon is we'll get a once-off shift that'll affect the carbon account. It might do that over 30 odd years. And really, we're in guessing territory. What's it going to contribute to the carbon account for sheep in terms of reducing emissions? 5% to 25%? The jury's still out. Let's see. But one thing that's dawned on the farming community in the last 12 to 18 months is that those credits will only contribute to lamb and wool if we don't sell them to another competing sector. If you sell them on the open market to Rio Tinto, who's happy to buy them at market price, you won't also be able to claim that that's a reduction against your own carbon account. The whole system falls over if it does. So if it costs us money to generate them, how are we going to manage that cost in the market? What's possible in trees? Well, we've been asking hundreds of farmers one question. Without affecting productivity, how much could you improve tree cover on your property? And the answers vary widely, from 0%, we've got enough trees already, or we run a river flats type operation where trees don't fit, through to 10%. The highest quoted tends to be in WA, where tree planting's been a thing for a long while for a lot of other reasons, 10+%. And in that territory, you might reduce emissions again for 30 odd years by 5 to 25% at the top end. And Mark Wheaton's going to talk more about that tomorrow and his experience in it. But the thing is, it's going to last for a period of time, and so it achieves an outcome in that context. It probably suits the high rainfall zones where you've got some hilly country, maybe some degraded country, and regeneration in the low rainfall zones. Now, calling a spade, regeneration has some degree of inherent conflict with sheep grazing. We can do it, but we're going to have to manage and change grazing systems to achieve that in rangeland areas with spelling and so on to let regeneration occur. Beyond that, we get into the territory where we're actually asking, do we have to set aside land in a more dedicated fashion? That's a big challenge, obviously. Agroforestry, that becomes the next topic. Can we harvest the trees? Yes, potentially, but there's a whole new sector that grows up around that to achieve it. And just as with the point made with soil carbon, if you do monetise, you crystallise that asset, you sell it to another sector, you can't also put that on your own carbon account. Okay, so here's the real balancing act on the other side. What's it actually going to cost and who would consider paying for it? We've been running net emission reduction plans and costing them out at scale now for the last couple of years. And the key thing is it's really sensitive to price. So I'll take a few moments to explain what this figure's about. Down the far side, we've got the lamb price in dollars per kilogram of hot standard carcass weight, 10 down to 5. We've got cost of abatement in dollars per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, ranging from $10 to $200. And we've got what sort of increase you need in sale price for your product to break even if you're abating emissions at a certain level of ambition. So at a lower level of ambition, the first level of ambition there, maybe we can do that 10 to 15% by 2035 at a cost of $10 a tonne. There's a few low-hanging fruits. We can leverage the productivity. We can plant perhaps some forest species, and we're going to have some wins here and there on tree planting and other things. Maybe we can leverage that, and it'll be 1 to 3%, quite manageable territory. If we want to up that ambition, we have to go to technologies and strategies that come at a higher cost. The abatement curve moves, and 20% is probably going to put us into the $40 a tonne territory of abatement, maybe more. And then, of course, if you really want to ratchet it up, you end up in high cost territory. So today, we know, and we have clients in beef cattle feedlots feeding Bovaer as a supplement, feeding Asparagopsis as a supplement, at a cost exceeding $200 a tonne, cost of abatement. That's what it costs today on the market to feed those products. It's very expensive. Obviously, ratcheting that up has a significant effect on profitability. So that gives us a tightrope. What do we do? How do we walk it? Well, on the policy side and on the agricultural leadership side, we really need to grapple with this issue of methane. And the fact is we can deliver the same warming outcomes with 20 to 50% reductions, not net zero. That would be a very significant shift for agriculture in Australia. It would be worth billions of dollars by 2050 to make that jump. And it would make some of this far more achievable. We could then set realistic emission reduction targets and plans. We could communicate in a massive effort to customers that we are on a different path here. 20 to 50%, pending transition support may be achievable. To fund that, we need long-term partnerships. Demonstrating what can be done on commercial farms and expectation management. And lastly, for farms, you've got to own your own emission profile. You can't switch off. You've got to measure, as we've heard a lot about, and focus on better data and productivity. Partner with the proactive supply chains and think twice about selling carbon assets before you move down that path. Lastly, it's a long-term view and it's a long-term journey. Thank you.